Welcome to Alborada Online, Britain and Chile's 9/11. Great to be doing another Alborada Online, joined by some excellent speakers. Really pleased to have them here. I'll introduce them in a moment. Just before we do that, a little bit about tonight's event. I'm sure everyone here is aware that just last month marked the 50th anniversary of the coup d'etat in Chile against Salvador Allende's government of 11th of September 1973. A lot of what we will be talking about this evening, of course, will be related to that, but with a specific focus on the role of Britain in supporting the dictatorship in Chile. As well as, perhaps a launch pad to look into other areas of Britain's support for Chile through British, perhaps media institutions. I know one of our speakers today has done a lot of work on that, while our other speaker was in Chile when the coup took place and subsequently came to Britain as an exile in the 1970s. It is also, of course, 25 years since Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998, which sparked a major campaign for justice for victims of the dictatorship. Again, we'll be hearing a lot more about that. And also, it's 4 years since the protests, the social revolt, the social explosion, the mass uprising, whatever your preferred terminology is, in Chile on the 18th of October 2019. So there's been several important anniversaries lately in Chile, and obviously those protests were in response to the ongoing legacy of the dictatorship and the gaping inequalities that are a product of the economic system that was put in place, as well as the kind of repressive policing authoritarian model, which still kind of holds it all together, even though a great many Chileans are economically oppressed by the system in place. But it's, if you spend time in Chile, around Chilean protests, you'll see that authoritarian policing model is still very, very important to maintaining these economic structures in place. So my name is Nick MacWilliam. I expect probably most people here know me, but yeah, my name is Nick. I'm the co-director of Alborada. I lived in Chile for a number of years, from 2010 to 2014, or Piñera Uno, as they call it, whenever I speak to Chileans about when I lived there. I've written extensively on Chilean politics and culture for a wide range of media, online magazines, print magazines, newspapers, and so on. And I'm also the director of the documentary Santiago Rising, which came out in 2021 and focuses on the social explosion that I was just describing. Hopefully the magic of the internet will put a link to that in the chat. So I would like to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who will have some time. Each speaker will get a turn to speak. I will probably ask a question or two, follow up, and then we'll open it up and hopefully spark a conversation. Yeah, obviously, the theme of the talk is Britain and Chile's 9/11, but obviously, that's, as I said, that's a launch pad that can lead perhaps to other interesting areas of related debate and conversation. So anyway, so our first speaker is John McEvoy, who's an independent investigative journalist who has extensively covered the UK's role in Latin America and elsewhere. And he is the co-director, along with Pablo Navarrete, who I expect everyone here also knows, who is the co-director of Alborada, and John and Pablo Pablo is the co-editor of Alborada. John and Pablo are co-directors of the forthcoming documentary Britain and Chile's 9/11. Have I got the name right? Sorry. Yeah, Britain and the Other 9/11. Pardon me. God, I'm on a roll now. Britain and the Other 9/11. There's a crowdfunding campaign to get this really important story out. So please do support the crowdfunder if you can, if you haven't already. Even if you have, please feel free to support again. So we'll be joined by John, and then we'll also be joined by Sara De Witt, who is a former political prisoner under Pinochet, who moved to Britain as a political exile. Sara has, for a very long time, campaigned for justice for victims of the dictatorship, and was very involved in the campaign to prosecute Pinochet when he was arrested over human rights violations. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to John. John, if you'd just like to, talk about the topic, what was Britain's relationship with the Pinochet regime, and other areas of your research that have touched on that. And over to you.
So, as many of you who are here will know, the British government welcomed the coup in Chile in 1973. It was a Conservative government under Edward Heath. And, it was Britain was one of the first European countries to recognise the incoming Pinochet regime. The relationship that later formed between Margaret Thatcher and Pinochet is kind of infamous now. The pictures of Pinochet and Thatcher meeting together in his Surrey home while he was on house arrest, the pictures of them going together for tea, shopping at Harrods and so on and so forth. But only in 2019, just 4 years ago, actually, almost to the day, it was the end of 2019, just before the start of the pandemic, the UK government released around 10,000 files into the UK National Archives. And these files showed not only details of kind of military and intelligence assistance that Britain provided to the Pinochet regime following the coup that we didn't already know about, but they also showed that throughout the 1960s that Britain had actually orchestrated a covert propaganda operation and launched a series of forms of special political action, all of which were designed to prevent Salvador Allende from ever being elected. So this, the film is called Britain, the Other 9/11, but what we're really looking at is a kind of 40-year span of history, really, a 40-year span of British malign intervention in Chile. And what we want to do really is another thing that we already knew about was the extent of CIA interference, not only against Allende when he was elected between 1970 and 1973, but it was also brought out in the Church Committee in the 1970s that the CIA had funded, over 50% of the election campaign of Allende's opposition candidate Eduardo Frei in 1964. So what we're really doing is we're bringing in the kind of history of British covert action in Chile, the history of kind of British secret operations, that hasn't, that's never been fully told to this degree. And I suppose we'll talk a little bit more about Thatcher and Pinochet and a little bit about the extradition situation a little bit later. But yeah, I just wanted to start off by outlining the film.
That's great, John. Thanks a lot for that. I'll pass over to Sara now. Sara, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your what brought you to Britain, what it was like arriving as a political exile from Chile in the 1970s, and if the reality that you found here matched your expectations before coming here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Sara De Witt, and I came to United Kingdom in December 76. The reason that I came is because I came as a refugee. I was finishing my social work training in the university in Santiago, and the secret police took me, kidnapped me from the street, and I was nearly 2 years in detention. During that time, my mother managed to get me the visa to come to the United Kingdom and a place at Bradford University. So when I came out of prison, I went home, and because I wanted to remain in Chile, but I wasn't able to do it because I was being threatened, like telephone call, we are going to kill you, and so on. So I came to the United Kingdom, and I stayed for a little while in London, probably nearly 2 weeks, and off I went to Bradford. In Bradford, I was welcomed by volunteers, and I lived there for probably perhaps 2 years and a half. What I can say is that looking and comparing, my situation with the people that are coming now, arriving now, it was totally different because I was able to live within a community. I was able to try to talk to my neighbors, see people, take buses. I was able to work. I went to the Bradford College and studied English. Then I went to university. And I think that was very helpful for me. When you feel part of a community, it's really, if you are part of a community, you are not a person somewhere there. Okay, that is, what else did you ask for?
Just if your expectations prior to coming differed in, or did Britain that you arrived in match the expectations that you had before coming here?
I think that when I came, to be quite honest, I was shocked, really. I was shocked because I came to the UK probably 2 or 3 weeks after I came out of prison. And plus, before coming here, I was in what it was called safe house. So I was a bit shocked. And I knew very little about the United Kingdom. I thought that it was a place with a lot of rain and mist. And I wasn't expecting very much, really, because my plan was really to stay for a little while and then go back to Chile. Because in my fantasy, I thought that something like what had happened, like the coup d'etat and the dictatorship, couldn't really last very long. So I had a little suitcase and I was trying not to buy anything and just to prepare myself to go back. Yeah, it took, I don't know how long, not very long, not very short either, to convince myself that I better settle here, learn the language and do the course in the university. So it was a bit sad.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Obviously, everyone as well, feel free to put your questions for Sarah and for John in the chats. Either I can read them out at the end, but I think we can also, if you want to come on the camera and ask them directly and comment, obviously feel free. This is quite, this is a discussion and everyone's invited to participate, but let's obviously try to keep it close to the theme and to give our speakers a good chance to speak as well. So John, I'd like to come back to you, please. So I think probably a lot of people are very aware of the US involvement in the coup against Salvador Allende, Nixon telling Kissinger to make the economy scream. It's very well documented. The CIA pumped funding into Chilean right-wing media. They backed the lorry drivers' strike, which created food and shortages of other essential goods. Obviously, certain members of Pinochet's cabinet studied at the University of Chicago. Members of the secret police studied at the School of the Americas. And this all seems to have been quite well documented through journalists, academic research, filmmaking, and so on. It seems like Britain's role is much, much lesser well known, murkier perhaps. One thing that is quite commonly cited is that as the coup took place and people were looking for sanctuary as they were seeing their friends being arrested, detained, and so on, that several European and foreign embassies, but including most European countries, opened their doors to give asylum to those who were trying to escape from the army. But Britain kept its doors firmly shut and refused to take anyone in for asylum on its embassy in Santiago. So I just wanted to ask you, what was the attitude of the British government, which was led by Edward Heath, a conservative government under Prime Minister Edward Heath? What was their position towards the Allende government? And were they aware, as the US quite clearly was, that the military was plotting against the government and that a coup was being planned?
Yeah, cheers, Nick. Yeah, so I just want to briefly talk about something you just mentioned before I answer the question directly, which is when you spoke about the British Embassy in Santiago refused to take exiles in at the time. And for the film, actually, we spoke to Mike Gatehouse, who is the former former co-lead of the Chile Solidarity campaign. And he was in Chile at the time, in fact, and he was imprisoned in the central stadium in Santiago. And he kind of recounted to us the kind of horrible time that he had and the things that he witnessed. But he was eventually let in to the not the embassy, but the residency of the British charge d'affaires. And he explained his time with him was actually worse than the time that he spent in the stadium. He said he was such a cold, duplicitous and sinister man. That the time that he spent with in his residency was actually worse than the time that he spent in the stadium. But in terms of the British position on Chile relative to the US position, I mean, in 1970, after Allende is elected in September and takes up the presidency shortly afterwards, you can see from the recently declassified files that the British government is fully aware that the US is not going to tolerate an elected Marxist in Chile, in Latin America, in its so-called sphere of influence. So they're already basically discussing the position that the US is not going to tolerate, and the US is not going to allow this government to continue to exist. Just a year afterwards, in fact, Edward Heath travels to the US. He meets with Nixon, and he also meets with Kissinger. And this is a document that I don't think has actually been touched upon in any media. And they meet, and one of the things they discuss is Chile. And Nixon basically tells him in a very diplomatic way that we're not discouraging the forces that are trying to overthrow the government. And he basically says, in the kind of most indirect way that politicians can manage, that, yeah, we're aware that there are elements within Chile, right-wing elements within Chile, that are working for the overthrow of the government, and we're encouraging them to do so. So the Heath government was aware as early as 1971, not only that the US government was fundamentally opposed to the Allende government, which was obvious to anybody at the time anyway, but it was also encouraging elements within Chile in the name of a coup. The documents also show, well, I mean, the documents that I've been looking at, we don't even need to go to the 1970s. As far back as 1962, the British government, or in fact something called the Information Research Department, and the Information Research Department was Britain's secret Cold War propaganda unit, set up in 1948. Kind of had its heyday in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was the largest internal unit of the Foreign Office. And what it did basically was collect information on socialist and communist organisations abroad, and tried to delegitimize them through covert propaganda operations. And so during the 1960s in Chile, the IRD is actually collaborating with the CIA, and it's also using CIA front groups such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and it's using them to disseminate propaganda against the left in Chile, and also to turn the left in against itself in Chile by basically trying to drive a wedge between those, the Popular Front movement, or within the Popular Front movement, within those that preferred violence as the means of achieving power and those that thought they could do it through the ballot box. So even during the 1960s, we've got collaboration between the CIA and Britain in order to prevent Allende from ever being elected and to delegitimize the left. During the 1970s, well, the period 1970 to 1973, Britain continues with these covert propaganda operations. But strangely, the CIA has declassified tons of material, tens of thousands of pages of material and files on its covert operations in Chile. But in every single file, the area where it's supposed to, the area where the CIA is mentioned on the IRD files, it's systematically redacted. Every single file where the discussions or the collaboration with the CIA should be has been totally redacted. So although we know to a certain extent that there was a serious amount of collaboration between the CIA and Britain's kind of covert agencies at the time, there's still a massive amount of information that we're yet to know, and it's kind of laughable given the amount of information that the CIA has already declassified.
Thanks, John. Yeah, really, really useful, important background into Britain's role. People think that, well, British colonialism, of course, formally ended a lot in the 50s and 60s of many countries around the world, but it's Britain's role in trying to influence and meddle in other countries, particularly economically, but also militarily, is something that goes on today. And I think there's a certain certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've had a pretty brutal reminder of the agenda of the British government when it comes to how it will behave ethically, morally, to see its interests upheld in other parts of the world. Perhaps that's something we'll come to later in the talk as well, because I think a lot of us are feeling deeply angry with what our government and also the political opposition are doing in this country at the moment. So, but we'll come back to that later in the chat, maybe. So, Sarah, I would like to go back to you, and you know, I think it'd be really interesting to know about what was it like being, you know, in Salvador Allende's Chile. You know, we hear so much about it from a political perspective, from a kind of a liberationist perspective in the terms of, you know, as part of the global South. What was it for you? You know, what were you doing politically and culturally during this time under Allende?
I think that I would say, before what I remember, before the time that Allende was elected, there was quite a lot of political movement in Chile, demonstration, people getting organized, quite a lot of discussions. When I was, for example, doing secondary education, teachers would make the point in making us read books that were showing the history of Chile, what the situation was. And people were having meetings, well, at least where I was living, people were having sort of political meetings. So people were very aware, the majority of the people were very aware. Probably when I was around 15 years old, I joined the Communist Youth. And I stayed there probably for 1-2 years, and then I left it. And when I went to university, I joined the MIR. I joined the MIR because was a more radical political party, and I had the opportunity to work with people who was working in factories in shanty towns. Now, when Allende was elected president, there was such, how may I say, there was such a movement. It was an inspiration because we all thought that we were achieving something. And I think that initially with the government, what happened that he had a plan, Allende, with, I think that the initial 40 measures, and everybody was involved. Or that is what we felt. And at least, and also, you know, there was quite a lot of movement with related to culture. So it was something that it was the politics plus the culture. And with the university students, there were many activities for people. For example, to go to shanty towns, to the countryside, to teach people how to read and write. So trying to finish with the illiteracy. And things, you know, that I observed myself and I saw, it was about how the government was trying to look after and protect vulnerable people, women. And for example, in poor places, they start setting up nurseries for the children, where there was a legislation that every child was going to have a pint of milk. So to finish with malnutrition. So everybody was sort of getting integrated. Now, myself, as part of the political movement, something that I was doing was taking the paper and going and selling the paper, or trying to sell it in the shanty towns. And it was such an experience for me, because you could believe that because people are poor, live in poor area, they didn't understand about politics. On the contrary, I was receiving myself lessons about it, the importance about moving forward and supporting the government. So it was really, really a very optimistic, you know, period of everybody's life. And you could observe them and see how people were moving forward and changing during Allende government. Because initially, you know, although it was true that we were participating, people became more and more aware that how much the government was at risk and issues to do with boycott, black market, and so on. And that meant that people start organizing themselves, you know, organizing about getting food for people and distributing it. People in the factories as well start organizing because there was a shortage of spare part, you know, to help the machines. And also because many people from the owners of the factories, for example, they were boycotting, they were not producing. So I was able to see when I was doing a social work placement in a place, how the workers organize themselves because the owner was trying to close down the factory, and they say, no, we are going to continue with the factory and we are seizing this place, and how they organize in such a way that they start distributing the items they were making, basically refrigerators, to other unions. So to other unions, when I'm saying to other, yeah, they organized with other unions and they were distributing the equipment they were creating to people who need it.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting insight into what it must have been like living there. You know, I imagine it was a time of great excitement and hope. But then also resistance towards what, you know, what must have been also a very intense opposition campaign towards Allende and his supporters, not only from within Chile, but of course externally as well. I'd like to move on a bit now. And obviously, you know, the Pinochet dictatorship, it strengthened its power, consolidated its position through extreme human rights violations. Mainly in Chile, but it also expanded these into other countries around Latin America, working in collaboration with security services, intelligence services, and other military dictatorships in the region. This was called Operation Condor, of course. Probably the most famous case was the assassination of Orlando Letelier and his assistant Ronnie Moffat in Washington in 1976. John, back to you. What was Britain involved, or, you know, did Britain have knowledge of the Operation Condor program or other similar international collusions between the intelligence services of different Latin American dictatorships? And did the British government at any point condemn what was happening in Chile under Pinochet?
Yeah, so there's a few parts to the question, I suppose. In February 1974, not long after the coup, you know, about 4 or 5 months after the coup, some of the recently declassified files show that not only was Britain offering, you know, as we already knew, diplomatic support through recognition, some military support by way of arms sales, but Britain was actually collaborating with Chile's military intelligence. And what it was doing was it was providing counterinsurgency advice to Pinochet's security apparatus in order to, you know, facilitate him to have a more sophisticated domestic security policy. And the kind of manuals and booklets and advice that Britain was providing to Pinochet security services at the time was all based on Britain's recent, well, relatively recent counterinsurgency operations across Southeast Asia. So what we're talking about specifically is the war in Malaya, where Britain was engaged in, you know, put about 500,000 Malayan civilians in concentration camps, killing fields, aerial bombardment, a massive propaganda operation as well. So the kind of manuals that were developed out of this counterinsurgency campaign in Southeast Asia were then exported to Latin America, and not just Chile. This is across the continent, which is interesting because, you know, if you read, you know, like Greg Grandin's Empire's Workshop, the general thesis is that Latin America kind of functioned as the workshop for how the US developed its counterinsurgency programs back to the Middle East. and elsewhere in the world. But what you see and what's not known, in fact, and it's what we're going to cover in the film, is that during the 1960s, well, 1960s and 1970s, Latin America, I mean, the Southeast Asia is functioning as the workshop for counterinsurgency that's being exported to Latin America. So, first of all, Britain had direct contacts with Chile's military intelligence. That's what the files have recently revealed. And as you say, this was at a time where Foreign Office officials were privately acknowledging that, you know, and I quote, "I don't think anybody doubts that torture is going on here." And they were also producing their own internal figures on the amount of people that had been extrajudicially assassinated, on the amount of people who had been imprisoned politically, and on torture figures as well. So yeah, we have this kind of direct link between the Chile's military intelligence and Britain. In terms of Operation Condor, one of the things that we go into in quite a lot of detail, in fact, in the film, is the case of William Bosir. And William Bosir was a key victim of Operation Condor. He was a Chilean British national. His father was British, and he was taken in 1975 while he went to study in Europe. And while he was on an airport transfer in Argentina, he was picked up within the context of this transnational clandestine network of Latin American military and intelligence services. He was picked up in Argentina, transferred back to Chile, bounced around a number of different torture and detention centers in Chile, and you know, we can safely assume eventually killed. So this was a British national, and you know, his family put immense pressure on the Foreign Office to try and help to resolve this case. It was never resolved. His family still don't know for sure where he ended up or what happened to him. So Britain was involved in Condor to the extent to which, you know, British nationals were being picked up in this, and the Foreign Office wasn't adequately defending them. As a matter of fact, during the Thatcher government, a documentary came out on the BBC about the Bosir case, and the Foreign Office got inundated with letters basically complaining about the case, saying you need to do something about this. This is a British national who, you know, has clearly been put into torture centres in Chile. And Foreign Office officials, this is under Thatcher, bear in mind, Foreign Office officials are kind of sending these letters, these angry letters to one another, and saying, "Oh, here's another letter about the documentary for your amusement." So they actually find it quite funny, the amount of kind of public discontent about this case. You can get a sense of, you know, the extent to which the Foreign Office placed the relations with Pinochet over the health of British nationals themselves. The third element that I wanted to briefly touch on is there's only one file, at least to my knowledge, and to the knowledge of many of the people who are working on Operation Condor itself, that shows there's a direct European element to Operation Condor. So I think it was in 1977 that a European delegation comprising British, I think French, German, and Spanish travelled over to Argentina to basically learn about the different techniques, the kind of transnational, clandestine, repressive techniques that were being used in Latin America at the time, with an eye to actually exporting them back to Europe. So there was an effort to go and learn, excuse me, learn what was happening in Latin America with this kind of murderous military and police apparatus, particularly in the Southern Cone, and to bring it back to Europe. So that's the kind of third element of Britain's links with Operation Condor and the military intelligence apparatus in Chile.
Thanks, John. I mean, yeah, really, really shocking collusion. Well, shocking in some ways, but in other ways, not at all shocking. You know, the role of British involvement in these kinds of crimes in other places is a historical consistency, and we should also be aware. You know, as you said, Britain seemed to prioritise its relations with Pinochet over the well-being of a British national who was being tortured. There's a lot of British people who have relatives, families in Gaza at the moment, of course, and the British government, of course, is far more concerned about preserving its relations with Netanyahu and the White House to issue any kind of plea for a ceasefire, or, you know, to call Israel, or to call on Israel to stop the bombing. So, you know, these things are continuing even as we speak. I would like to go back to you now, Sarah. talking of Operation Condor and the human rights situation under Pinochet, do you know anyone who was directly involved as a victim in that way? And also how, Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998, which for people like yourself and many other Chileans, and particularly exiles who had been in London a long time, how did that feel? And can you talk about the campaign? What did it involve? Did you feel pressure from Chile? Were there any threats coming from Chile towards people who were campaigning in Britain? Yeah, if you could describe that, and then that will lead on to the next part of our discussion.
Yeah, about the Operation Condor, I think that at the time I didn't know anything myself about the Operation Condor. They have been, for me, and I suppose for other people, have been a long process of learning. For example, I knew that the United States was involved, the USA, but I didn't know about other countries. And there were many things that I didn't suspect, For example, I wasn't myself quite clear how dangerous was the government to the United States, and why, they were bothering and going ahead about trying to overthrow it. Now, I didn't know anything about Operation Condor. I was in Villa Grimaldi, and I was in April 1975. After I left Villa Grimaldi, I knew that they have detained a man that was, I think that they detained him in Paraguay. I forgot his name, and he was in a box because other prisoners saw him. But what I could tell you about torture, that I was a witness of a killing. There was a man detained. He was 27 years old, and what they did, they hung him, and they beat him up with chains. I don't remember how long they beat him up. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I did hear him dying for probably over 24 hours. That was a very bad experience, really. His name was Sedomir Lausik. And that was my experience more close with torture, on top of the torture that I received for part of the secret police. Regarding the other question that you said, about the picket, about when Pinochet was detained here. Since I came here, I have been with other Chileans working for human rights. We have all the time working for human rights, but really, truly, I thought myself that never would happen anything until I received the telephone call of one of my friends who said, Pinochet was detained. I couldn't believe it, and I thought that he will stay detained for, I don't know, perhaps 2, 3, 4 days, and he would go. And it was a big surprise, really, about how the whole process, developed. And it was very interesting because there were so many things that we saw from the side of the politicians, from the people, from the legal side, and the organization of our community. Because our community came, the people who came here because they were exiled, they came all together. And I could say something that it was very, very interesting and rewarding, was to see that what we call, or they call themselves, the second generation took the leadership. Those are the children of the Chilean people who came with them. They were 4, 5, 6, or they were born here. They took the leadership of the picket, and they did quite a lot of organizing. And it was really, really very interesting. Now, about threat, personally, I didn't receive any threat, but I knew that we knew that people felt threatened, because usually the Chilean consulate and embassies everywhere in the world, we knew that they had, shall we say, secret police officer. I mean, for example, they name our Orlando Letelier that was killed. A journalist in Paris was killed, and they don't discover who did it. So we knew that there were people observing and trying to infiltrate ourselves. But the most rewarding thing, I would say, was to see the young people that they kept the memory. We managed to pass the history to them, and they were doing the leadership. Now, it was very hard to be there in front of the clinic and in front of the parliament every day, because I, like other Chileans, were there every day. For example, I was working full time, and I could arrive there 6:30, 7, and there was some Chilean who would bring food. That was lovely, because coming after work, especially in winter, it was very nice to have something to eat. And I was standing there. I did abandon a bit my daughter, who was a teenager. But, we knew that we have to do that in order to detain Pinochet. I presented a lawsuit against Pinochet with another woman who was in detention with me, Cristina Godoy. But we didn't go very far. It was thrown out. And so, we were thinking that he would go, but nevertheless, I think that in spite that Jack Straw, and probably with the pressure from the United States and European, I don't know, the politician, they let him go. I think that it was very interesting, the outcome of that from the legal point of view, that you could detain former dictators or president or whoever in a place and take them take them to court. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. And obviously, we really recognize the difficulty that people like yourself, what you went through, and to talk about it, to share your experiences. Very, very important to keeping the memory of what happened and letting other people know about it. And that's a real testament to the determination of so many in Chile who kept fighting despite the terror and what was going on. But I'd just like to continue that. I'm just going to ask one more question to both of you connected to this, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please, everyone, do get your questions ready for John and Sara. So you mentioned Jack Straw, right? It was a Labour government that freed Pinochet, that rejected the extradition request. How did you feel about that? How did you react at the time in terms of your experiences and dealings with the Labour Party since you'd come to this country? Did that surprise you? Were you hoping for more? And John, in your research, have you come across much involving the Labour Party, and what was the party's position towards what was taking place in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship? So we'll go to you first, Sara, and then to John, and then we'll open up to questions.
Well, when I learned that Jack Straw and the Labour government was allowing Pinochet to return, I was very disappointed, especially when Pinochet was initially detained. All of them appear, making a statement, or some of them making a statement about this horrible man, etc., etc. But then they collude, and I think myself, that they just behave like professional politicians looking after each other. And that is what they do. They protect themselves. Now, my guess is that probably, the Chilean politician put quite a lot of pressure, probably the United States. Hence, it's not surprising for me about what they did. Very disappointed, really, very disappointed, because it's quite clear. I think it shows that we don't matter, really. That is how I feel. And the sad thing is that you elect the politician, and at the end of the day, they do whatever they want to do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sara. John, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, the Labour Party's kind of history in general in this process is it doesn't get much better. Working backwards from the extradition decision in 2000 when Spain decided not to extradite. I mean, during the irony is, between 1974 and 1979, we had two Labour governments, one of Harold Wilson, the other of James Callaghan, and I mean they did fundamentally alter British foreign policy in Chile. This was as a direct result of massive trade union resistance to British policy in Chile, massive trade union resistance to Pinochet's atrocities as well, and also obviously the Chile Solidarity campaign. So during the kind of mid to late 1970s, you see the Harold Wilson government accept thousands of Chilean refugees. There was an arms embargo on the Pinochet regime. They removed the ambassador from Santiago as well, which was fairly unprecedented at the time. So you did get a major improvement of British policy under those governments. But the thing is, it was under the original or the first Harold Wilson governments where the British government was actually attempting to prevent Allende from ever getting elected. So you've got this kind of a paradoxical process whereby the Labour government first is like engaging or presiding over covert action in Chile and secret measures against the left, and later on, a decade later, it suddenly realizes that maybe this was a bad idea, and obviously a lot of that boils down to not the moral code of the politicians, but the position that the trade unions and the solidarity organizations put them in, where they felt forced to take that position. In terms of when you ask about the extradition process, so the next time the Labour government is in power, 1997, there's a couple of things that have come up. The first of which is pretty much, I think it's the day after the extradition request goes out for Pinochet, and Tony Blair and his aides are kind of discussing what to do about this. One of his key aides, someone called John Holmes, basically approaches him and says, "Look, there's kind of an awkward affair here. We'd promised Pinochet healthcare in Britain and basically a safe place to stay in Britain, as well as healthcare, in return for Pinochet's support during the Falklands War in 1982. As many of you will know, Chile was, a key actor, a key aid to Britain's war effort during the Falklands and Malvinas War. So Britain, as this document shows, had promised Pinochet healthcare, and that seems to have muddied the waters behind the scenes in the Labour Party's decision making. As Sara was saying, before Tony Blair came to power, the likes of Blair, Peter Mandelson, and many others were, talking at the Labour Party conference, going on the media and saying how much disdain they had for Pinochet. But like the Labour Party in general, once it got into power, those kind of institutional pressures were put onto it, and it folded fairly quickly. The other thing I wanted to mention was the principle of universal jurisdiction, which the case threatened to implement on a global scale, so that political actors who've engaged in atrocities, crimes against humanity, and war crimes could be prosecuted for them in a foreign jurisdiction, in a jurisdiction not of their own. And we spoke to one of the key Chilean actors who was engaged in the extradition process, who was actually engaged in lobbying the British government to get Pinochet returned to Chile. And what he told us was that, what Britain really worried about was having this symbolic, success of the principle of universal jurisdiction. Because, of course, 5 years later, when Tony Blair launched the illegal war in Iraq, that would have opened him up to prosecution in a foreign jurisdiction as well. And so imperial powers like the UK, the US, Spain, they don't want that principle. They don't want that principle at all, because it will open them up more than any other country to future prosecution.
So avoiding setting a precedent was at the forefront of Labour Party minds, of Jack Straw's minds. Would you say that's a fair conclusion to draw?
Yeah, in my view, that was the key reason, and it's not just Jack Straw's key motivation for doing so. As Sara was saying, we could be fairly confident that the US government, particularly, was pressuring Britain not to extradite. That Spain also was pressuring not to extradite, and of course there are different reasons for that. I mean, Spain didn't want the trouble of the case to be brought there. The Chilean government was pressuring Britain because it saw it as an issue of sovereignty and said that Pinochet should be tried in Chile. But fundamentally, the actors with the most power in this situation, which is the US and Britain, the key concern in my view for them was that if you start prosecuting war criminals in foreign jurisdictions, that's going to create a very dangerous precedent for the US and Britain.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John. So, well, we've got one question in the chat here, so hopefully we'll get a few more. But from Humberto Albarella, has there ever been an attempt to prosecute a British officer for their crimes? After all, they provided their services so that people could be tortured and killed. Well, I guess, John, has your research taken you into any attempts to hold any British agents, officers to account over their involvement in what took place in Chile? Do we need to unmute you?
I'm back, I think.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, in my research, which obviously focuses on British foreign policy in Latin America, I don't think I can think of one case where a British political actor or a British official has ever been prosecuted, or there's ever been an attempt to prosecute, and that's despite knowing that Britain engaged or taught torture techniques across Latin America during the Cold War. That's despite knowing that Britain not only supported the coups in Chile, Brazil, and elsewhere, but actively engaged in creating a coup climate for them to happen. And the reason for this is, I think, twofold. One, once again, is that that if you start prosecuting British officials, particularly British military officials, for past crimes, then that's going to make British officials in the future a little bit more resilient to engaging in atrocities, and the British state in a large degree relies on atrocities to maintain its power, because such an unequal pattern of power cannot be maintained without violence, and the very real violence often happens in the peripheries away from what we see, but it relies on this violence. Nonetheless, the second reason why this hasn't happened with regards to Latin America is, I think, because it's been traditionally, except for Chile, a pretty peripheral concern of the British left. And that's obviously because of the perception that British foreign policy in Latin America has been negligible since the Second World War. So there's not been any kind of maintained public pressure to even reveal what's happened, let alone prosecute those who engaged in crimes.
Okay, thanks, John. And for Sara, I'd just like to say, to ask you as well, just to speak on that topic as well. So when you've been campaigning, your years as a campaigner for human rights in Chile, did you ever come across a campaign to hold any British officials to account, to publicize, raise consciousness about their involvement in some of the crimes of the dictatorship?
No, not at all. I never met anybody. No, I was in detention with Sheila Cassidy, and what we made sure, and that when she came here, and she was happy to, and she agreed with that, that she will disclose what she saw while we were in detention. Because I think that I am under the impression that she has some pressure about not to speak about what she experienced.
Okay, thank you very much. And would you just like to briefly summarize who Sheila Cassidy was, for anyone who might not have heard of her?
Oh, well, Sheila Cassidy was a British doctor who was working in Chile, and she was linked to the Catholic Church. She was a Christian. And she was asked by the church to help a man who was on the run and who had been injured. He had a bullet. And she did so because she was a Christian. Unfortunately, the DINA was discovered that she had been the person. She wasn't happy. They went to detain her, and they killed the maid of the house. And they took Sheila to prison, and she was tortured. She had a rough treatment, electroshock, although she was explaining to the secret police that she was British, to no avail, and she stayed with us for some time in detention.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thank you. So I'd like to move on to our next question, and we've got a question here that basically brings everything to today. As I mentioned at the beginning, in Chile, these huge protests erupted in 2019 over economic inequality, state repression, all of which was a legacy of the dictatorship, but was then, these structures were then kind of reinforced during the governments which followed Pinochet. You know, the economic model, the anti-trade union legislation, that none of that was significantly changed. You know, the country had been made safe for big business, so to speak. So in 2019, we saw these huge protests erupting over that, bringing together various different political demands, social movements, and so on. But one of those was that was for the new constitution. So we replaced the 1980 constitution, which was written under Pinochet, which excluded the vast majority of the population and basically entrenched the economic model and legitimized state repression. So we've got a question from Ian. Obviously, the constitutional process has come a long way, but a progressive draft was rejected late last year. And earlier this year, a new vote for who would write the constitution saw the right and the far right take a majority of seats. So Chile's in a very tricky position at the moment of potentially going from Pinochet's constitution, and there was this great vision to have a progressive document which could provide a foundational document for a more progressive and equal society. And while that was rejected, they could now end up with a constitution that's even more right-wing than the existing one. So our question from Ian is, what do the speakers think of the current moves in Chile to replace the Pinochet constitution and the alarming turn they have taken in the last year or so with the right back in the leading position? Any updates on the second exit referendum in December? So if you could just maybe elaborate on that. Will the left be supporting the new charter, or is there a chance it will be no better, indeed worse than the current one? And what comes next? So I guess to summarize that, your views on the constitutional process and the fact that the new draft is being written by a majority of right-wing and far-right representatives. I'll go to you first, Sarah.
Okay. Well, sometimes it's difficult to appreciate what people think in Chile when you are so far away. But my impression, or what I think, is that one of the problems with the constitution in Chile is that it has been a long process by which, again, the political parties get hold of the process of a constitution, and they do it as they please. And that is what happened after the revuelta. The first, the draft of constitution that was rejected. And what they did, they have dealings and so on, and they set up a new process, which probably is worse than the first one. I think that I obviously don't know what is going to happen, and whatever people vote, if they vote, the both of the Pinochet constitution and the new proposal, they are really bad. I think that the problem with the constitution in Chile is that it's not the people who live in their cities, in the small villages and big villages and so on, they are not participating. The people who participate in the previous one and in this one mainly are professional politicians. Hence, it's very difficult. We are going to get a a constitution that people are happy with. They have been going on for, not only now, they have been going on for over a century about the new constitution. There have been many revolts of people trying to engage and do a constitution, but it happened always the same. They pull, they pull the carpet under people's feet. So I'm not being very hopeful about what is going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. John, would you like to come in on that topic, on the constitutional process? You were in Chile a bit earlier this year with Pablo and with me. I was there too. I mean, what did you take about the constitutional process from speaking to people then, and from other conversations and reading that you've done?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, well, I mean, I can't add that much to what Sarah said, and I think you're a much better place than me, Nick, as well, to comment on Chile's constitutional process. But one thing I will add, that this is more historical, but this goes back to, once again, Britain's role in Chile. So when Pinochet was drafting the 1980 constitution, none other than Brian Crozier was often in the room with him. And Brian Crozier was he wasn't an MI6 officer, but he often collaborated very closely with MI6. He was a contact of the Information Research Department, and he also went on to be an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. So in 1980, when Pinochet is drafting this constitution, Crozier says in his autobiography, and others have said it as well, that he authored at least 2 pages of it. So you've got a British influence over the constitution as well. I don't think I'm the best placed person here to talk about the most recent developments, but yeah, there's quite an interesting history there as well about British involvement in the constitution that they're trying to get rid of, and obviously the neoliberal policies that it engendered were inspired by the same people that Thatcher was inspired by. Okay,
great, thanks, John. Okay, this next question might be a bit more to your field of expertise. The media under Allende. Obviously this question is for both of you. This is from Kate Clark, who's also written a very good book on Chile, which I think someone can post a link to in the chat. So Kate Clark, her question: the media under Allende was largely owned by the Edwards family, and they had a lot of power. They were always adamantly against the UP government. Do you think that the right-wing media bears some responsibility? The question's just disappeared. Do you think that the right-wing media bears some responsibility in the September 1973 coup? John, I know you've written on this kind of stuff. There's a documentary which I encourage everyone to seek out as well, called the Diario de Agustin's newspaper, which is about the El Mercurio media group. But first, I'd like to ask Sarah, when you were in Chile, and particularly around kind of 1972, early parts of 1973, when the campaign really intensified against Allende, how did you feel the Chilean media was behaving? And what was the impact it was having?
Well, at the time, we had papers, and we didn't have the internet, so people were buying papers. And many political parties and groups and so on, they were printing their own papers. So there was an abundance during the Allende government of papers. What is true is that the main papers were controlled by the right wings, and they were doing the usual that people do, where people still do now, about lying and not presenting the real facts. And we all know what happened with the Edward people, how they colluded with the American and they asked for a coup. As I said previously, I used to go and sell or give away the papers of my political party. And so when I was talking to people, I felt that poor people were very, very well informed. But what I want to say about the papers, once Pinochet, when we have a change, and the dictatorship finish, unfortunately, the government of the Concertación, they finished with many of the papers that were voicing policies against the right wing and dictatorship. So the media now in Chile is very, very poor and only one-sided.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And to you, John, the same question: the media role in Chile under Allende, but then also post-military coup in covering up for the dictatorship, and also elements of the international media.
Yeah, so the media played a fundamental role in the coup, and that obviously one of the key problems, as Sarah mentioned, was the ownership of the media in Chile at the time, and it's something that plagues more or less every country still today, that the ownership of the mainstream media is often in the hands of oligarchs or big corporations. And obviously El Mercurio was the most clear example. I think just recently new documents were released in the US that showed that, I mean, Augustin Edwards had said for much of his life, well, he denied for much of his life the extent of collaboration that he had with the CIA prior to the coup. But new files recently came out to basically show that he went for a meeting with the CIA, that he was informing them, that he was procuring contacts for them in Chile as well. So yeah, I mean, the right-wing media, aside from its horrendous coverage at the time, and the Chilean media played a core role. And Britain, as well as Nick asked about international media, Britain had a number of contacts in El Mercurio that it was feeding information to, that it was providing sources with, that it was basically offering anti-communist or anti-left propaganda material, and El Mercurio was using that and publishing it. As I think Pablo has put in the chat, I recently went to the trouble of reading about 100 Economist articles from the time, so you don't have to. And The Economist between 1970 and 1974, or 1973, but after the coup as well, was publishing every single week really strong, like vehemently critical articles about Allende, criticizing his economic model, criticizing his commitment to democracy. But what he was also doing was ginning up the idea of a coup. The Economist Latin American editor, who was in Chile, a man named Robert Moss, was in contact with a lot of military generals in Chile, and he'd speak to them and he'd go off and he'd write an article saying, it's only a matter of days now until there's a coup in Chile. So basically, like fomenting a coup climate, and the extent, the extent to which the Economist was critical of Allende's government. And bear in mind that the Economist doesn't have a byline on who's writing its articles. There's no like author name. It just publishes articles without a name. And these articles were being picked up in the Chilean press, being republished all across the Chilean press, to the extent to which Allende actually wrote a letter to a number of Chilean newspapers saying, look, I don't want to contest the freedom of the press here, but there's a clear problem with disseminating information that's being produced by a British newspaper without any responsible author attaching their name to it. And also The Economist's coverage was full of falsifications and disinformation as well. And to add to that, it turns out, as the documents that we're looking at, because we're also looking at the media aspect of Britain's role in the coup, it turns out that Robert Moss was another contact of the Information Research Department. So the Information Research Department was also providing Robert Moss with information that was then being disseminated through The Economist and then across the Chilean press, to the extent to which Allende has to complain. So the British media was complicit as well, and the Chilean right-wing media kind of viewed The Economist as a reputable, reliable source, and it still is. The Economist still is, to a certain extent, viewed as a reliable source today. So its association with the British military and intelligence, and the Chilean military intelligence, is certainly something that brings that into question.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. It is absolutely shocking to imagine that the British media could be involved in promoting manipulative and disingenuous information back in the 1970s. Isn't it wonderful how things have changed so much since then, how things have got so much better, I say with my tongue firmly in my cheek. And also, just a little bit of a self-plug here, for those asking about the recent constitutional developments, when we were in Chile earlier this year, in June, I produced a short news report. It's about 9 minutes long for the Real News Network, speaking to people, particularly women and LGBT activists, about how they were responding to the threats posed by the possibility of a far-right constitution, particularly in areas of LGBTQ rights and in abortion rights, which have only really in recent years been have come forwards to be respected and represented in the legal system, but which faces if there is a right-wing constitution, potentially a new right-wing government to follow Boric, will come under extreme attack. So please do feel free to check that out and to talk and to see what people are saying on the streets in Chile. I think we're probably going to start winding up soon. I've got a question that was sent to me directly. Let me just scroll up. This is from Brittany McGee. This is a little bit of a change. We can just, from the filmmaking perspective, a question for John, but I'd also like to open it to Sarah as well. But the question is, why is creating this documentary important to you? And what do you hope people will take away from the documentary when it is released? Sarah, I'd extend that question to you, just to say, what do you think it's important for people to know in terms of Britain's relationship with Chile, and any other area where you think perhaps public awareness is not as strong as in some other places? So I'll go to you first, John.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've never worked on a documentary before. I've never obviously made a documentary before. I've worked as a journalist for the last five or so years, 5 or 6 years. I'm doing a PhD at the moment as well, and I've done some academic work. But I think there's part of the story, obviously, is it's going to be a historical documentary, right? It's going to be based on a lot of our recently declassified files, some freedom of information work. But the event obviously happened 50 years ago, last month, and a lot of the people directly involved are still alive. A lot of the people have, direct memory of the events, and telling this story in a kind of visual way, I think there's a potential for it to be a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful than the kind of writing it up as a journalist or writing it up as an academic. I mean, nobody reads academic work anyway, so there's little point doing that most of the time. But the other element is, and I mean, to add to that too, the people that we spoke to were the sisters of William Bosir, the Chilean British national who I mentioned earlier, and we did a really long interview with them, and for them it was quite cathartic, and it was quite useful to talk about it and to know that people are still interested and that people still care about this case, and that people are still looking into what happened to their brother. So I think it's an important process both for us as the makers of the documentary, but also a lot of the people that we're talking to, who haven't been able to speak about it or speak about it publicly for either a very long time or at all. The other point I wanted to make is just from a kind of educational and I suppose activist perspective, is that people in Britain should really know what has happened in their name, what the British state has done in their name, what it continues to do in their name, and particularly Chileans deserve to know the extent of foreign meddling in their country, because they're well aware of the US side of things. But when me, Nick, Pablo, and Peter went back in June of this year, everybody we spoke to, including the grandson of Salvador Allende, who we interviewed for the film, they had no idea about the British side of things. They didn't have a clue that Britain was also engaged in the kind of meddling against Allende that we're uncovering. So yeah, there's a few reasons really. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks very much, John. And to you, Sarah, would you like to elaborate?
Well, I'm very happy about the documental that he's going to do. I think that it's like putting pieces of jigsaw together. I was saying to you early on that when I came to the UK, I thought that I was going back to Chile within a year or in a year time. And that was mainly, through ignorance and lack of information, really, because I think that for me, at least, it has been a very slow process to understand issues, that happened probably from after the Second World War. What was the role of Friedman? What was the role of John Keynes? What was the role of the United States? How they were looking at Latin America. So having more information is really, really very good. I welcome it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. I think we're probably going to start wrapping up. So just before we finish, I would like to again say thanks to everyone for coming. Please do support the crowdfunding campaign for Britain and the other 9/11. You can also support Alborada. Independent media can only exist with support. Obviously we don't get funding from anywhere else, just directly from people who follow us and support our work. Yeah, do keep your eyes peeled as well for other films by Alborada Films on Chile and other issues. You can find out about those by emailing or just looking online. I'd like to just offer both our speakers, if they'd like to finish off with any other words. I'll go to you first, Sarah. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Thanks very much to everybody. I hope that I was clear. Okay.
You were very clear. It was really fascinating. We really appreciate you coming here. It's been it's just been a really good diversity of voices in this panel. Two of you, John, who's done so much research to carry, to bring so much to the light, to put it in public records. And then from you, Sarah, who lived it, who experienced it directly from Allende, then the horrors of the dictatorship, then the campaign for human rights, the campaign to prosecute Pinochet, and so on. So it's been really, it's been a real honor to hear from you and so on. So John, I would like to ask you as well, is there anything you'd like to wrap up by saying?
No, just same as Sarah. Thanks to Sarah for joining us. Thanks for hosting it, Nick, and thanks for everybody who came and listened as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah, that's it really. As I said, please follow Alborada, please support the film. The crowdfunder chat is the crowdfunder link is in the chat, and also we'll be putting this out as a podcast, so we can send it to you or once it's out, and then please do share it far and wide. So thanks very much, and we'll see you at the next Alborada Online event, no doubt.